BloodRayne is a game I've heard of a few times over the years, but knew very little about. It's often regarded as a classic, but also as kind of a bad game. Like, it has its fans, but even they seem to regard it as a bit of a guilty pleasure. And having recently played through it myself, I can see why. It's very rough around the edges and has plenty of flaws, and yet there's still a certain charm about it. It kind of reminds me of Shadow Hearts in that regard. In BloodRayne, you take control of Rayne, a female half-vampire who fights against bad vampires and other creatures of the night. Her exact motives for doing so aren't entirely clear, but judging from her actions throughout the game, I'd guess it's a thrill for action, a need to satiate her thirst for blood, and a moral obligation to make sure she only kills people and things that deserve it. The story starts with Rayne investigating a mysterious outbreak of creatures in a remote swamp village in Louisiana, but after she gets to the root of the problem, the plot makes a sharp turn, and out of nowhere it becomes about stopping a group of Nazi vampires. What is it with all the Nazi vampires in fiction lately?
Nazi vampires.
Damn it, that used to sound so cool. But then you say it so much and Nazi vampires just sound stupid.
Oh, right?
So, yeah, while I'll give the story credit for remaining relatively focused, it's still a bit of a convoluted mess. It doesn't take itself too seriously, which is good, but some of the character moments fell pretty flat. The main villain just kind of appears out of nowhere after the beginning section, and then we don't see him again until the very end of the game. And without wishing to spoil, let's just say that there was some stuff involving one particular character that was supposed to be rather heavy and important, but it was so rushed I found it impossible to care. Gameplay-wise, it's an action game. You can jump high in the air and navigate your way across platforms and obstacles, and you can use blades and guns to attack enemies. One unique mechanic is that there are no health packs, and in order to get your health back you have to suck blood from enemies. It's an interesting concept that works pretty well, and since some enemies are resistant or immune to your bite, it doesn't feel overpowered. Overall, the combat mechanics are pretty good, but they're definitely not as polished as, say, Devil May Cry 3. The level design is okay, but the layout of levels can often be confusing, and it's quite easy to get turned around and lost. To compensate for this, the game gives you a helpful marker showing you the direction of your next objective. It works pretty well, but it would have been better if the level design was more intuitive and less confusing, especially since there were several points where I still got stuck for a bit before I eventually figured out where I had to go next. Another slight problem is that the game's difficulty is kind of all over the place. Some parts feel reasonably challenging, others feel a bit on the easy side, and still others can be rather frustrating. Especially when you consider the fact that if you die, you lose a fair amount of progress. Not enough to be egregious, but enough to be really annoying. Most commonly, this will manifest with stretches of the game where you'll be dealing with lots of enemies that will constantly chip away at your health, while having little if any access to the enemies that can be used to restore your health. To compensate for this somewhat, Rayne has a slow-mo ability that she can activate at any time that never runs out and gives you more time to react and handle enemies. But just like with the objective marker, this feels like a band-aid solution to the flaws with the gameplay. If you're planning on playing this game, I would recommend looking up some of the cheats you can unlock for the game. I got the most use out of the health restore cheat, and while some might call me cheap for using that, it made certain sections of the game a lot less frustrating to get through, so I will not apologize for it. Also, there's absolutely zero shame in using cheats to get through the first boss. So the story is an over-the-top mess, the combat is decent but a bit clunky and repetitive, the level design is rather confusing, and the difficulty runs the full gambit from fair to frustrating. But despite all these flaws, there's still a certain charm about the game. Rayne is a very fun protagonist, and her banter with her enemies is quite entertaining, and there is just enough variety in the monsters and set pieces that you want to see what the game will come up with next. BloodRayne is not a great game, but it managed to keep me playing until the very end, so it must have been doing something right. My final arbitrary score is a 6 out of 10. I am now curious to see how BloodRayne 2 turned out. That's all I've got. Thank you for watching, and I hope to see you in the next one.
Maybe we'll find something else, like maybe a Nazi werewolf.
Mel, that sounds so much worse.